Most people think the quantum debate is a technical problem. Can quantum computers break Bitcoin? How many qubits are needed? How far away are we? Those are important questions. But the more I think about it, the more I realize they may not be the most important questions. Because even if quantum computers eventually become powerful enough to threaten Bitcoin, another question comes first. What if Bitcoin doesn't get a warning? Think about how most people imagine the future. Google announces a major breakthrough. IBM reveals a new milestone. Microsoft publishes another research paper. Year after year, quantum computing advances in public. Everyone watches the technology improve step by step. Governments prepare. Banks prepare. Security standards evolve. NIST releases new recommendations. Cloud providers begin migrating. The internet slowly upgrades. And eventually, Bitcoin upgrades too. This is the future most people imagine. A future where everyone can see the storm coming. A future where there is time to prepare. A future where the warning arrives long before the danger. And to be fair, that is probably the most likely scenario. But it is not the only scenario. Because technology does not always advance in public. Sometimes breakthroughs happen behind closed doors. Inside government laboratories. Inside military programs. Inside classified research projects. And if that happened, the entire discussion changes. The question is no longer when will quantum computers arrive? The question becomes, When will we know they have arrived? And those are two very different timelines. One measures technology. The other measures information. And markets care deeply about the difference. Because history shows that knowing something exists, and knowing it exists today, are not the same thing. That is where the real uncertainty begins. Security researchers have been discussing this possibility for years. They even have a name for it. Harvest now. Decrypt later. The idea is surprisingly simple. Collected data today. Store it. Wait. And when quantum computers become powerful enough, decrypted in the future. At first, this sounds like science fiction. But from a security perspective, it is completely logical. If you believe a future technology may eventually break today's encryption, there is an incentive to start collecting information long before the technology exists. Not because you can use it now, because you may be able to use it later. For governments, intelligence agencies, and large organizations, this is already a recognized concern. Which brings us to Bitcoin. And this is where things become interesting. Because Bitcoin is not a private system. It is one of the most transparent financial systems ever created. Every transaction is public. Every address is public. Every movement of funds is permanently recorded. And unlike many forms of traditional financial data, Bitcoin's history never disappears. A bank transfer from 10 years ago has already happened. The money is gone. The transaction is finished. But Bitcoin is different. Addresses remain visible. Wallets remain visible. Coins remain visible. Some wallets have not moved for years. Some have not moved for more than a decade. Satoshi's coins are still sitting there. Early miner wallets are still sitting there. Dormant addresses are still sitting there. Which means that if someone were thinking decades ahead, they would not necessarily need to attack Bitcoin itself. They could simply collect information. Wait. And focus on specific targets later. Not the entire network. Specific wallets. $5,000 Bitcoin. 10,000 Bitcoin. 50,000 Bitcoin. Addresses that have not moved in years. That is a very different threat model from the one most people imagine. Because the first victim of a quantum breakthrough may not be Bitcoin. The first victim may be a wallet everyone forgot about. And once you realize that, another question appears. If this possibility exists, why isn't the market panicking? At this point, a reasonable person might ask a simple question. If this threat is real, why isn't the market panicking? Why aren't institutions treating quantum computing as an immediate crisis? Why aren't Bitcoin investors talking about it every day? The answer is surprisingly simple. Because most experts believe the gap is still enormous. And that gap is often misunderstood. When people read headlines about the quantum computing, they usually see a single number. A few hundred qubits. A 1,000 qubits. Perhaps several thousand in the future. But those numbers can be misleading. Because the qubits needed to break modern cryptography are not simply physical qubits. They are logical qubits. And there is a huge difference between the two. A quantum computer may contain thousands of physical qubits. But after error correction, only a small fraction may become useful logical qubits. That distinction matters. A lot. Because when researchers estimate what would be required to threaten Bitcoin's cryptography, the numbers become dramatically larger. Not 1,000. Potentially millions. Millions of logical qubits. And that is why most experts remain calm. The threat is real. But the engineering challenge remains extraordinary. This is also why many media headlines can be misleading. A breakthrough in quantum computing does not automatically mean Bitcoin is vulnerable. Progress is not the same thing as capability. And the capability is not the same thing as deployment. The distance between a laboratory breakthrough and a practical attack may still be measured in years. possibly decades. That is why institutions are not panicking. Not because they believe the threat is impossible. Because they believe there is still time. But there is something about that explanation that has always bothered me. Because even if the timeline is long, another question remains. What if Bitcoin is not the first system that needs to react? What if somebody else sees the danger first? This is where the story becomes much more interesting. Because most people imagine the timeline like this. Quantum breakthrough. Then Bitcoin reacts. But reality is probably very different. Bitcoin may not be the first system that notices the danger. And it may not need to be. Think about who has the most to lose. National security agencies. Military networks. Global payment systems. Cloud infrastructure. Banks. Governments. The organizations responsible for protecting state secrets and trillions of dollars move before Bitcoin ever needs to. If quantum computing suddenly became a serious threat, the first alarms would likely sound inside those systems. Not inside Bitcoin. Imagine a future where intelligence agencies begin accelerating security upgrades, where banks suddenly changed long-term encryption plans, where cloud providers start migrating critical infrastructure, where governments issue new security directives. Those signals would be impossible to ignore. And many of those signals would likely become visible long before Bitcoin itself faces immediate danger. This is one reason why I pay more attention to organizations like NIST than I do to sensational headlines about quantum computers. Because NIST has already spent more than a decade preparing for a post-quantum future. Not after quantum computers arrive. Before. That matters. It tells us something important. The people closest to the problem are not waiting for the crisis. They are preparing years in advance. And if one day we'll see NIST, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and Cloudflare, all accelerating post-quantum migration at the same time. That signal may matter more than any new quantum chip announcement. Because at that point, the conversation has moved beyond research. The conversation has moved into deployment. And the deployment is where markets begin paying attention. Which leads to a surprising conclusion. Bitcoin may not be first. But Bitcoin probably won't be blonde. The warning signs would likely appear across the entire digital world long before Bitcoin faces an immediate crisis. And that raises another question. Even if Bitcoin sees the warning coming, can it move fast enough? But even if Bitcoin sees the warning signs, another problem remains. Consensus. And for many people, this is where the real concern begins. Because Bitcoin is famous for moving slowly. Not months. Years. Sometimes many years. Taproot took years of discussion before activation. Segwit took years of debate. Even relatively small protocol changes can take enormous amounts of time. And that creates an uncomfortable question. What happens if the warning finally arrives? Can Bitcoin move fast enough? At first glance, the answer seems worrying. Bitcoin has no CEO. No government. No board of directors. No central authority capable of forcing an upgrade. Everything depends on voluntary agreement. Developers. Manners. Node operators. Wallet providers. Exchanges. Custodians. ETF issuers. And millions of users. All moving toward the same goal. That sounds incredibly difficult. And sometimes it is. History gives us plenty of examples. The block size wars lasted for years. Different groups disagreed about Bitcoin's future. Different groups wanted different solutions. The debates became emotional. Political, personal, at times, it seemed impossible to reach consensus. Looking at that history, it is easy to conclude that Bitcoin may be too slow to react. But I think that conclusion misses something important. Because consensus behaves differently. When there is no deadline, imagine a town debating whether to build a flood barrier. The flood might come someday. Nobody knows when. Some people think it is necessary. Others think it is a waste of money. Meetings continue. Arguments continue. Nothing happens. Then one day, the forecast changes. The flood is expected next week. Suddenly, the conversation changes. People stop debating whether the problem exists. And start discussing how to solve it. The deadline changes everything. Bitcoin may not be any different. If quantum computing remains a distant possibility, consensus will continue to move slowly. That is normal. That is how Bitcoin works. But if the threat becomes visible, incentives change. ETF issuers begin asking questions. Custodians begin asking questions. Large institutions began asking questions. Exchanges began asking questions. And eventually, users begin asking questions. The cost of inaction starts rising. The cost of disagreement starts rising. And when that happens, consensus can move much faster than people expect. Not because Bitcoin suddenly changes its culture. But because everyone begins optimizing for the same outcome. Survival. And that leads to what may be the most important question of all. What if the biggest risk is not the technology? What if the biggest risk is simply underestimating the problem? So after all of this, what is the real risk? Is it quantum computing? Maybe. Is it Bitcoin's governance? Maybe. Is it the possibility of a secret breakthrough hidden from the public? Maybe. But I think the biggest risk is something much simpler. Underestimating the problem. History is full of risks that seemed distant. until suddenly they weren't. People rarely ignore danger because they are irrational. They ignore danger because the timeline feels long. Because there is always another year. Another decade. Another reason to postpone action. And that is what makes slow-moving risks so difficult. Not because they are invisible. Because they are visible for too long. The human mind is surprisingly good at reacting to emergencies. But it is much worse at reacting to possibilities. Especially possibilities. That may not arrive for years. That is why I do not think. The future of Bitcoin will be decided by a quantum computer. I think it will be decided. By how seriously people take the warning. Before the quantum computer arrives, the encouraging sign is that the conversation has already started. Developers are discussing post-quantum cryptography. Researchers are studying Sphinx Plus and other quantum-resistant systems. People are identifying vulnerable addresses. People are debating migration paths. The immune system is already waking up. And that matters. Because the most dangerous community is not a slow community. The most dangerous community is a complacent community. A community that believes there is nothing to prepare for. A community that believes someone else will solve the problem. Bitcoin does not appear to be that community. The debate has already begun. The research has already begun. The preparation has already begun. And that may be enough. Because the most likely future is not waking up one morning to discover that Bitcoin has been destroyed. The more likely future is watching the entire digital world gradually migrate toward post-quantum security. Governments, banks, cloud providers, internet infrastructure, and eventually, Bitcoin. Not because Bitcoin is forced to move. Because the incentives eventually become impossible to ignore. Which brings us back to the original question. What if Bitcoin doesn't get a warning? Maybe it won't. Maybe nobody gets a perfect warning. But warnings do not always arrive as announcements. Sometimes they arrive as signals. A new security standard. A new migration plan. A new industry-wide shift. A new urgency that wasn't there before. And when enough signals appear, they create something powerful. A deadline. And deadlines have a way of changing behavior. Consensus looks slow when there is no deadline. But deadlines have a way of creating consensus. That may be the most important lesson in the entire quantum debate. The real risk isn't quantum computing. The real risk is waiting until everyone agrees that the risk is real.